If anybody needs Bibles, by the way, there are a couple up here. You can use them. Greg said you cannot keep them. He will hunt you down if you keep them. So. Very good.
What if you don't own one? No.
I try to make other people the bad guy. No, if you do need a Bible, they're up here. So, Genesis 14 is where we are this week. Last week was Genesis 13. Abram and Lot separated. Where did Lot go? What was his decision in terms of him and Abram going different places? What did Lot do?
Lot stayed in the more plentiful, beautiful side. The land was rich, and that's where he stayed.
Yes, Lot saw the land that was good, that he thought would be the best. He ignored the fact, or maybe he was ignorant to the fact, we don't know, but the narrator lets us know the land was exceedingly wicked in terms of the people that were there. But Lot went that way. And it was eastward. It was away from the promise. It was eastward towards dispersion, like the Tower of Babel and when humanity was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Eastward is oftentimes biblical shorthand for away from where you want to be. And in this case, we're going to see what happens with Lot. After he separated, God reaffirmed his promise to Abram. He said, I'm going to give you all of this land that you're in, the land of Canaan, giving it to your descendants forever, your seed, your offspring forever. And we talked about last week, you can go on the website and watch if you missed it, but we talked about how that promise to Abram's seed is an ongoing promise in the Old Testament, and it may mean more than just promise to Abraham's ethnic descendants, because the New Testament sort of opens that promise up to a whole lot wider audience, so to speak. And Paul says some pretty radical things about who the seed of Abraham, the true heirs of the promise, really are. And that plays into discussions that people have today about the land and Israel and Palestine and all that kind of stuff, because people always jump back to Genesis 12, Genesis 13, but there's a lot of times that's where they stop instead of following through and seeing how that promise develops throughout both Testaments. And I mentioned it last week. I'll mention it again. Myself and Dr. Michael Brown are going to be having a debate. Not really a debate, more of a discussion, but like well, it'll be a debate.
A debate.
We're friends.
Friendly debate.
But a friendly debate. But at Gordon Conwell Seminary down in South Charlotte in April. And we're going to be talking about Jesus, Scripture, Israel, Palestine, and what do the church today, what should we think, how should we act, and how can we be Jesus in the world. So, we get to Genesis 14. Abram and Lot have separated. God has reaffirmed his promise to Abram. Back in verse 18 of chapter 3, Abram moved his tents to live near the great trees of Mamre. Mamre is a guy, by the way, a person, one of Abram's buddies we're going to see. And near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. Chapter 14. At this time, now here's where things are going to digress. This is a chapter everybody skips, because the names are hard to pronounce. And they want to get right to the next section of the chapter where Melchizedek comes into play, because we read about him in the New Testament. But let's walk through what happens here in this section. At the time, Amraphel, the king of Shinar, and we've heard about Shinar, that's the plain where they built the Tower of Babel. Shinar is the area of Babylon. Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, which is in Mesopotamia, sort of between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Kedorlaomer, the king of Elam. Tidal, the king of Goyim. And Goyim is the Hebrew word for nations or Gentiles. The NIV, if you have that, they just left it because it's a title, but it's king of the nations. Tidal, king of the nations, went to war, so 4 kings went to war against Bera, the king of Sodom. This is where Lot lived. Bersha, the king of Gomorrah. Shinab, the king of Admah. Shemeber, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. And that'll come into play in the next couple of chapters. So, 4 kings against 5 kings. All these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, the Salt Sea, which is the Dead Sea. And here's the background. For 12 years, they'd been subject to Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year, they rebelled. So here's the setting. You've got these 5 little kings, Bera, Bersha, Shemeber, Shinab, and the king of Bela, who we don't even know his name. These are little tiny, when it says kings in the Old Testament, we think king, mighty, powerful. No. Think of it like the village elder or the tribal chieftain. These cities in the Old Testament, the city-states back then, were tiny. Most of them were tiny. And the king, the Melech, that's the Hebrew word, it just means the big man, the one who runs it, the one who's in charge. So the king of Zor, that's this tiny little city. We're going to see later in Genesis, it's so tiny that Lot pleads to God, let me run there and hide, because it's so insignificant that I can be safe there. These aren't kings like we think of today, King Charles and King, not even like King David.
Could it be like a mayor in there, or even less than that?
Mayor, sort of, but these kings were usually, they ruled because of their strength and their power. Most mayors today you would not want to follow into battle. These were sort of like, just think of like tribal or feudal warlords, so to speak, over these little fiefs, these little areas. So you got 5 of these, and they're all clustered around, if you had your Bible with a map, they're clustered around the bottom area of the Dead Sea and up. Okay, so you're facing me, so this is the Dead Sea area. The Sea of Galilee's up here. They're all clustered sort of in this area down here. And this is the area that the scripture says at the time was beautiful and it was lush and it was amazing. So these are where all these kings are. Now the text says for 12 years they served this other king, Chedorlaomer, who was up here somewhere, like up off in the Mesopotamia, Babylon type area. And the king that they served for 12 years, it says in the 13th year, in the 13th year they rebelled. So this is a known phenomenon in the ancient world. In the ancient Near East, there were powerful kings. And powerful kings would either conquer or liberate smaller kings' areas. And as a result, or in terms of the agreement, the smaller kings would agree to become the vassal of the powerful king. The powerful king would be known as the suzerain. The suzerain was the one who had liberated or had defeated an enemy or had captured a city or a land and had basically either enslaved the inhabitants or had liberated the inhabitants, but they were now going to serve him. And they would make treaties. We have these treaties from all around the ancient world. They're called suzerainty treaties. And it basically said, they're a certain formula. They're compiled in a certain way. They're written in a certain way. And they basically are a contract between a powerful king and an insignificant or less powerful ruler or people. And the contract usually says that I, the great king such and such, am so awesome and so wonderful, and I've liberated you, and I've done all of this wonderful stuff to you. That's called the historical prologue. It's part of the contract. And then it says, now, as a result, here's what you're going to do for me. Then there'd be stipulations. You will give me, a fifth of all of your grain. You will give me this much silver per year. You will worship this God and not that God. There were terms to the deal. Then after that, there were blessings if you kept the contract. If you continue to serve me as a faithful suzerain, I will make sure you always have water, you always have food. I'll make sure no armies attack you. I've got your back. You are protected. It's kind of like a mafia boss. You pay them what they're due, they protect you. But it's a contract that sucks you in because you can't stop paying them what they want, because then you have what happens next, which are the curses. The curses would come next in the suzerainty covenant. They'd say, if you break this agreement, then, and usually the curses were twice as long as the blessing, and they were horrible, horrible things. And they told about the fate, I'll destroy you, I'll crush you into the earth, I'll make it so that your women and your children starve, I'll smash the heads of your infants against the rocks, just this bad, awful language that was basically saying, do not break this covenant. And it would call down curses from the gods and everything. And then it would be ratified. There'd be a sacrifice that would be made. Sometimes there'd be a ceremony, which we'll see in the next chapter, and involving the killing of an animal. And then the two parties would partake of a meal, usually together. Then they would have 2 copies of the covenant. 1 copy would be taken back to the suzerain's palace and kept for records. 1 copy would be kept in the place of the vassal, either in the temple of his god or in the city gates or wherever the authority was. And they were basically, it was like a carbon copy of the contract. So both people knew, these are the rules, this is what happened, this is why you're serving me. And this is what's going to happen if you don't serve me. So that's the situation that's going on at that time of Abraham. These 5 little insignificant suzerain or vassals made a treaty with this powerful king, Chedorlaomer, and and said, we'll be your vassal, we'll serve you. So they did that for 12 years. And then in the 13th year, it says they rebelled. They stopped. They said, we're not serving you anymore. So that's when we pick up in the next section. This does not make the king happy. In the 14th year, so the year after this, Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Rephaites in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzites in Ham, the Emites in Shaveh Kiriathaim, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran near the desert. They turned back and went to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites, as well as the Amorites who are living in Hazazon Tamar. Now, these place names are just gibberish to us. But in the ancient world, or the world of this time, basically, these little kings down here in their little city-states at the southern tip of the Dead Sea, they decide they're going to rebel. Chedorlaomer and his guys, who are big-time kings up in the north, in Babylon and Mesopotamia and all of these places, Tidal is just known as king of the nations because he's just a big guy. They all combine together, and they basically swoop down and just rampage through all the way down. Just wipe out and conquer everything in their way. And then they go all the way down to the desert, and then they turn back to get the remaining that they've left behind. And that's the image of what's going on. These are powerful armies that are coming through and just taking people after people after people and crushing them and subduing them and conquering them. It's just this juggernaut of an army, or of 4 kings' armies. So it's a really powerful alliance. This is not just like little skirmishes. I mean, this is an international event, so to speak. And these little kings, they've done it. They are in over their heads. So then, verse 8. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zor, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of the nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. It seems like be in their favor since there's 5 of them, but it's completely not. It would be like 4 towns against the United States or something. I mean, it's just very lopsided. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them, while the rest fled up to the hills. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, and they went away. So far, so good. That's what happens when you rebel against your suzerain. You just get beat down, and you get your stuff taken, and you flee into the hills, or you sink in tar pits, which that didn't always happen, but in this case, it did. Then the 4 kings, verse 12, they also carried off Abraham's nephew, Lot, and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. So, Lot, this is now, we tie in this international story that seems like just a complete diversion from where we were in chapter 13. Now we see the strand that draws it back into our story, which is Genesis is the story of Abram. And we see that in this international conflict, Abram's nephew, Lot, and his goods and his family were taken because he had lived in Sodom. So Lot leaving the promised land of God, Lot leaving Abram, it basically was stepping out of that covering of the covenant blessing to Abram, stepping outside of that protection, and because of that, he was subject to all of the goings-on, all of the conflict, all of the drama, all of everything of the people that he wanted so much to be part of. And he gets taken up in battle, captured, and all of his goods plundered, because of who he had allied himself with and where he had settled. So his decision to step away from God's promise and step away from the line of the blessing, the seed promise that was Abram, is now, he's basically cut his lifeline. He's out floating on his own. And the big wave came. Or in this case, 4 big sharks came, if you want to really extend the metaphor. So, now, verse 13. One who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. Now Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and of Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Now, Dan is up in the north of Israel. It's pretty far up. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. Damascus is in Syria, which, if you're paying attention to the news, it's been in the news lately, so way up from where they're supposed to be. He recovered all the goods, brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. So we're going to pause here now. Abram gets word. Your nephew's been taken. So Abram and his 3 buddies, powerful allies that he's formed, say, basically Abram says, I'm going to go get him back. And it says that he called out his 318 trained men. This is a cool verse for me because, one, it's the actual phrase is he poured out or he emptied out. It's kind of like, I mean, it's the word for to pour or to empty something. So it's like he had these guys kind of ready and it's just lets them loose, like, let's go. Abram wasn't a passive shepherd just petting lambs all day. I mean, he was a statesman, he was a warlord, he was a patriarch, he was an important person. And the word trained men, it doesn't appear anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. And the verb form of it appears elsewhere in terms of the idea of being dedicated, like dedicating a household later in I think Deuteronomy. But there's good reason to think that because of how it's used in other languages or similar wording, that it means something like retainer, a trained. The best example, and I love it because my whole ministry is based on it, is a samurai. If you know anything about Japan, the samurai were the retainers of their lord. They lived and died based on his word. That's the image my little website guy is, a samurai. But it's someone whose life is completely devoted to their master and who is specially trained and equipped to do whatever their master needs done at the drop of a hat. And that's the image of what's going on here in Abram. It's a very different image of Father Abraham than we're used to. This is Abram, the Lord who has trained men under him. He has his army of Hebrew samurai. And they go out, and it says, he poured out all his men, and they chase these 4 kings, these massive armies, all the way up north. I mean, days and days this would have been. They chase them, and they completely rout them in the night, using a little guerrilla warfare and some, later this will be made popular by guys like Gideon in the Old Testament, but they basically go in and just smash these guys and send them fleeing. A huge army. 300 and something men. God will do that again under Gideon, by the way. He'll use 300 men to overthrow the Philistines. So you have this image of this should not happen. Abram his guys are as good as they are. They're still 318 versus however many thousands. We don't know. But as the reader, this shouldn't surprise us because when God made his promises to Abraham back in chapter 12, what did he say? Those who bless you, I'll bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. In other words, I've got you. I'll make your name great. You'll be a great nation. Abram is acting within the covenant promise. He's in his land. These kings are coming through, and they seize his family, his seed, so to speak. They seize his family members, take them off. So he goes and gives chase. This would be in the Old Testament a just war. This would be a war that would be condoned by the Old Testament, particularly in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 20, I think, Deuteronomy 20 is going to give rules for Israel, how they should engage in warfare, and it'll be surprisingly similar to Abram. Again, the life of Abram is giving a miniature preview version of Israel's history later, even in terms of how he conducts his warfare. And so in this case, Abram takes his men, his retainers, he gets his stuff back and all of the things that have been taken from this evil city, and he brings them back. And as he brings them back, the king of Sodom, who had fled, whose army had been beat, comes out to meet him and is excited because Abram's brought his stuff back. All right?
Is the number 318, does that have any significance at all, J.M.?
Not anything that I've seen specifically, other than that it's really small. It's a very insignificant number compared to an army. But he comes back. The king of Sodom comes out to meet him. But before that, then in verse 18, this little strange incident happens. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. So this king, Melchizedek, don't know anything about him. His name means my king is righteous, or king of righteousness. And he's from the city of Salem, which is just the word for peace. It's from the Hebrew word shalom. He comes out and he blesses Abram. Now, this passage generated all kinds of later myths and notions of who Melchizedek is and what he is. And he's talked about later in the Psalms. He's talked about in Hebrews. And they play on the fact that in Genesis, he has no genealogy. He has no history. He's just in and out. But when he enters, he comes in blessing Abram by God Most High. So he's a king, he's a foreign king, he's a pagan king, but somehow he has this knowledge of or relationship with God Most High. And he's a priest. This will all be picked up on later in the New Testament. But what it does, it gives us a glimpse that, one, God is working outside of just Abram. Right? God is working outside of just the promise. He is doing things in the world outside of the story that we're reading in the Bible. He's bigger than this story. There are hints and glimpses throughout the Old Testament of these righteous Gentiles or these righteous pagans or these people who shouldn't know anything about God, but they do somehow, and we don't know why or how. So he comes, he blesses him, and then it says Abram gives him a tenth of everything. Abram tithes to him. A pagan king. He gives him a tenth. Why does he do that? Remember, those who curse you I will curse. Those who bless you I will bless. You will be a blessing. Abram's doing what God's called him to do. He is blessing this person who has seen in him God's hand at work, has recognized the God Most High, who in his mind, in Melchizedek's mind, up until that point, he may have just thought of El Elyon as this random ancient Near East God. But at this point, he recognizes that's the God that's with Abram. And he's the creator of everything. Which at the time, that was a novel concept because most of the God, there wasn't one single creator God. That was a uniquely Hebrew concept. So Melchizedek, however, somehow has been drawn into relationship, or his relationship is confirmed through this encounter with Abram. And there's this mutuality. And Abram gives him a tenth of everything. Abram tithes to Melchizedek, to this pagan king, who's also a priest. Now this will be important because in the Old Testament later, God will stipulate priests only come from the line of Aaron. Priests only come from the Levite tribe. High priests from the line of Aaron, priests from the Levite tribes. And those are the ones who you give offerings to. Those are the ones who run the worship of Israel's daily life. But here we have a priest who's not from the tribe of Levi. He's a priest outside of the Levitical promise, the covenant promise that hadn't even come yet. It's still 400 years away. And yet Abram is tithing to him. The New Testament will pick that up and will say that is a type of or a prefiguring of Jesus himself. He's not from the tribe of Levi, yet he is both a priest and a king, just like Melchizedek. So the New Testament authors will use Melchizedek as a precedence for the fact that you can be a priest to God even if you're not in the Levitical line, and you can be a king and have Israel or Hebrews pay homage to you. So that in turn, a lot of people have said Melchizedek, but for that reason they sort of misread it and they say this is Jesus, like pre-incarnate Christ showing up. But you don't get that at all in the text. That's a later concept. What you do get is a prefiguring of the ministry of Jesus, what he will do. The true king of Salem, king of peace. The true king of righteousness, Melchizedek. So there's a lot, there's again, like in Genesis, there's hints and there's glimpses and there's foretastes of things to come, all in seed form here. So Melchizedek blesses Abram. Abram gives him a tenth of everything. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people and you can keep the goods for yourself. You keep the plunder, just give me my people back. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and have taken an oath that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the thong of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten, and the share that belongs to the men who went with me, to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them have their share. So Abram's basically saying, I don't want anything in return. I don't want any payment from you. I don't want you to ever be able to say, I contributed to the blessing of Abram. I gave you the wealth. Because Abram knows he's a wicked king. And Sodom's a wicked place. And we're going to see just how wicked very soon. But at this point, what Abram's saying is, my men, the Gentile guys who are with me, they can give what's rightfully theirs. If they want some pay for their duty, provide for them. I'm not taking anything. I'm not taking anything from you. My blessing comes from the Lord. Melchizedek came out with bread and wine. The king of Sodom came out saying, hey, how much do you want? Let me write you a check. Thanks for the war. Like, I appreciate that. I fled to the hills and my guys ran the tar pits. But you went out and won the battle, so let me pay you back. And Abram's like, no, none of it. He's not putting himself in debt to this king. He's not giving God any of the glory that this king could claim if he were to provide for him. He's not having any of it. He's staying faithful. And this chapter is Abram at his best, so to speak. And this is God's promises unfolding, just as God said they would. And it's right after this, then, that we're going to have the third appearance of God to Abram, reconfirming this promise. So these key significant moments, and then God will show up and reconfirm. As Abraham steps out in faith, God reconfirms it. He goes a little further, God reconfirms it. And the next scene is going to be the most dramatic of all, and it's going to be the most bizarre of all. But next to Genesis 12, Genesis 15 is the most important chapter in terms of understanding everything else in the rest of the Bible. So we're over time. Thanks a lot. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.